It's Thursday, April the 27th. Welcome to Business Morning. I'm Chimize Obi Iwago. In the news, the federal government has reduced the membership of the National Council on Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises from 43 to 21. The Vice President, Yemi Osinbajo, while inaugurating the new council, which he chairs at the Presidential Villa, Abuja, says the decision to streamline membership of the council was meant to ensure that results were achieved without unnecessary bureaucracy. The council, which also serves as the coordinating platform for the implementation of all development programs within the subsector, especially the National Enterprise Development Program, was first launched in 2014. According to the Vice President, the MSME sector is the bedrock of Nigeria's industrialization and inclusive economic development, and therefore it is important to re-emphasize the point that the Council will have the same success delivery platform as the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Committee. And the rise of financial technology in banking services is an indication that banking standards need to be redrawn in some quarter. This development, which was brought to the fore at the just concluded 22nd World Conference of Banking Institutes in Lagos, was examined by Moody's Analytics Executive Director, Mr. Ari Lahavi. In his presentation to the bankers, he discussed how voluntary and regulatory standards could shape the stability of fintech.
I'm going to start with the distinction between regulatory standards and voluntary standards. I think it's useful to think about that because there's an overlap and it's not always clear the difference, and it gets conflated at times. And there are different approaches associated with each area, and so when you think about regulatory standards, often called policies, they're intermixed with that. These are imposed by regulators. They're mandatory, enforceable by law, and then there are voluntary standards, and those are developed by the industry and for the industry, and when they work and they work effectively, they actually become embedded within regulatory framework and get disseminated across both nations, regions, regimes, and international organizations. I want to highlight the fact that it is obviously extremely important to develop regulatory mandates and standards. We all know that. It is essential. But the reality is that they're not always optimally set up. And part of the reason I'm highlighting here is at times you see regulatory standards being developed on the heels of a crisis. They can be reactive, aggressive, a bit of a blunt force. They can often lead to a backlash. Then they get relaxed, get people pushed to relax those standards, and when they do, we end up with a new wave of trouble, and then we come back to new regulations. And so it's not an optimal way of developing standards, but it is one way that things happen that create disruption, and if and when it can be avoided, it's preferred as long as we achieve the same results. And then I'll note that either regulatory or voluntary standards are all designed for the same purpose that we discussed throughout this event so far. It's about building trust, stability, safety, confidence in the system. When it comes to thinking then about international standards, developing standards become even more complicated. Regulators that are trying to accomplish this find it even more challenging to establish a framework that applies to so many different regimes, so many different types of institutions, so many different needs across markets. And so often they have to contend with some additional layer of what I'd call discontent. Voluntary standards, when appropriate and can be developed, those are industry-led standards, are probably preferred by the industry. They're set by the industry for the industry. So where they can be accomplished, they are great. But they're quite complicated to do. They require so much coordination. It's harder to enforce. It's harder to implement. It's harder to build consensus. And that becomes ever more challenging in the face of international requirements. As we talked about the evolution of banking with new technologies, perhaps shifting the way the banking world will become over time, it is really important that if we are to survive and remain as viable mechanisms to intermediate and provide access to capital, that we restore, rebuild that trust.